and it is lovely to be here. Great to be giving a talk where I don't have to can you see my slides? Am I on mute? So I want to talk about design and the design process, which straight away introduces a problem, because then we're going to have to define what the design process is, which is notoriously tricky. Here's one way of looking at the design process. This is the design squiggle by Damien Newman at IDEO. And, it's you can think of it as like a graph over time, and you see the amount of chaos and possibilities narrowing down until you get to that one solution. I think it's actually a pretty good description of what the design process feels like for an individual designer. This is probably what it's like inside your head during a project. I'm not sure it's a great description of the design process in terms of the collaborative aspect, looking at a design project. So there's another diagram that kind of resonates with us at Clear Left, we tend to refer to a lot, and that's the double diamond view of design. This was from Chris Vanston at the Design Council. And one way of thinking about the double diamond model is that it's kind of like two design squiggles back to back. You begin with lots of possibilities, you're going wide, and then you narrow in, and then you do that twice. And the idea is you've got these four phases where you're going wide with discovery, and then you go narrow with definition, and you go wide again trying to figure out how you're going to execute. Once you know how you're going to execute, you deliver, you go narrow again. So the main point here is that you're diverging, then converging, then diverging, then converging. And this is the part that's actually really useful, because the double diamond isn't necessarily accurate. Like on some projects, one of those diamonds is twice as big as the other, and it's not like these four things take up an equal amount of time on every project. Every project is different. But this idea of being explicit about we are now diverging, and then being explicit when you say, okay, now we need to converge and make a decision. That's super useful. In fact, that can be applied to almost anything. Like, if you're going to have a meeting, get a bunch of people in the room, one of the best things you can do is declare at the start of the meeting whether it's a divergent or a convergent meeting. If it's a divergent meeting, you want to make that clear. You say, hey, we're looking for lots of ideas here. There are no bad ideas. Because what you don't want is in a divergent meeting, everyone's throwing ideas out there, but there's that one person in the room who's converging, who's going, that'll never work. Here's why that's a bad idea. It's like, now's not the time. This is the yes and phase, right, rather than no but. Conversely, if you're trying to have a convergent meeting, like it's a week until launch, and you need to make a decision on something, make that clear at the meeting too, right? Okay, we need to come out of this meeting having made a decision. You do not want one person in the meeting going, just had an idea, right? So, in fact, if you take nothing else away from the talk, that's super useful for meetings, is just define whether this is a divergent or a convergent meeting. So at Clear Left, this design agency I co-founded years ago, we spend a lot of our time actually in the first diamond. I think at the beginning we did a lot more work in the delivery phase, how to deliver something, but now we spend a lot more time, I think, helping companies figure out, what the problem is, and then helping define a solution. The way you sometimes see the double diamond described is the first bit is about building the right thing, and the second diamond is about building the thing right. And maybe in the past we were concentrating more on building the thing right, and now we spend more of our time on building the right thing. So we've got a number of different kind of exercises we do, often in the discovery phase. We got one called Fluffy Edges, which is literally like a card game we play. And this is kind of about role mapping, figuring out who's doing what. We found that a lot of projects, you'd be halfway through the project before you'd realize there'd been a misunderstanding about who was responsible for what. And you'd end up at a stage where two people thought they were responsible for the same thing, or nobody was responsible for something because they thought somebody else was, right? So we have these cards like, who's going to do X, who's going to do Y, who's responsible for that? And we have very early on get those roles defined and kind of have fun with it. We've got this other exercise called a project canvas, which is kind of mapping out. It's kind of trying to get stuff out of a stakeholder's head and down onto paper into a diagram. You can find blog posts. We've written about all these things. A pre-mortem. Has anyone ever done a pre-mortem on a project? Oh, pre-mortems are good. So pre-mortem is where you go in and it's kind of like it's almost like a design fiction exercise. You go in and say, okay, it's 6 months after launch and it's been a complete disaster. what went wrong. And you get people to play out in their imagination, well, it went wrong because this, and it went wrong because that person, sabotaged it. It went wrong because this technical limitation. And you get all those things out of people's heads really early on so that you can address them then, before you've gone and built the thing, right? So a pre-mortem is a good exercise. And of course, it's the early phase. The one thing we absolutely do is research. Design without research is kind of designing blind. Any researchers in the house, actually? Yes, excellent. Designers get all the credit. You're doing all the work. And what all of these things do, all of these kind of exercises, is they're all trying to surface assumptions. Like, everyone begins a project with assumptions, and the problem with assumptions is because they're assumptions, you don't realize that not everyone shares those assumptions. Oh, I assumed you realized we had this technical limitation. Oh, I assumed you understood that this stakeholder would be having the final say, whatever it is. Assumptions are what we're trying to surface as early as possible in the design process, either to verify them and turn an assumption into a hypothesis, or nullify them, doing the research and finding actually that assumption is incorrect. So kind of need to define what an assumption is. The way I think about an assumption is it's like your expectations combined with your biases. The biases are the kind of things you've internalized. And this is what makes them assumptions. You don't even think they're worth saying because they're so internalized to you. And everyone has biases, right? So everyone ends up having assumptions. And it's kind of recognizing that everyone's going to have assumptions. Let's get them out in the open. And this sounds kind of bad to talk about, biases and assumptions, but that's not necessarily true. One way of thinking about biases is your values. These are the things you hold true that are internalized. They're kind of your assumptions about life. And values are biases, and values lead to your assumptions, how you live your life. I'm talking here about values kind of in the personal sense, right? But also organizational values. And most organizations have some values that they hold to be dear. At Clear Left, we have our values. I'm not going to share Clear Left's values with you for two reasons. One, there are values, like they're specific to Clear Left, so I'm not sure it would be in any way helpful to share Clear Left's values with another organization. Two, there is nothing more boring than an organization sharing their values. I mean, I'd say nothing more boring. Perhaps the only thing more boring than that is when a so-called friend insists on describing a dream they had. And you have to sit there and nod politely as they describe something that only makes sense to them. That's what it's like when organizations share their values. We don't care. But what values are about is kind of your purpose, the why. Why are you doing something? And I'm not just talking about organizations or making software here. Any endeavor should kind of begin with a purpose. There should be a reason to it. The example I sometimes give is if you look at the United States of America, and it began with the Declaration of Independence. That is kind of encoding the purpose. Here's why we're doing this, right? These literally truths we hold to be self-evident. That's the values, that's the internal biases, the assumptions, self-evident. And then, once you've got your purpose, you know what your purpose is, you can from there get to your principles, which is kind of well, how are we going to go about this endeavor, whether it's software or building a country, right? So in the case of the United States, it would be the Constitution. So you begin with the Declaration of Independence, that's why we're doing it, and then you get to the Constitution, this is, how we're going to go about it. And then, finally, all of that is reflected in the patterns. These would be the laws of a country, for example, or in the case of software, literally the design patterns, the interface patterns. We heard about this yesterday. We were talking about design systems, talking about how the principles are the foundations that are then reflected in the patterns. I would say that the purpose goes kind of going even deeper, what influences the principles. So, your purpose influences your principles influence your patterns. And that's why I'm kind of fascinated by the principles part, because they sit between the two, kind of bridging the why are we even doing this, right down to the pixels on a screen or whatever the product is. So this is design principles, the sitting in between the purpose and the patterns. And I'm a real sucker for design principles. I'm just fascinated by them. I'm kind of a design principles nerd, so much so I collect design principles. You can find them at principles.adactio.com. It's like my online equivalent of an interesting rock collection, right? I just gather them. I don't pass judgment. I don't say, oh, these are good or these are bad. I just whenever I see anyone's published design principles, I grab them and I stick them onto this web page. Like I say, I try not to be judgmental about them. I would say not all design principles are good. And it is interesting to document these things, because sometimes they disappear or they get moved and they're hard to find. Like Google used to have a very easy to find list of principles called 10 Things We Know to Be True. It's a lot harder to find those principles now. I think they are still out there somewhere. And that's where you'll find their design principle. You can make money without doing evil. Don't know why they're hiding that one. That's weird. Actually, Google have another set of design principles called 10 Principles That Contribute to a Googly Experience. They've probably hidden those ones away just out of sheer embarrassment of saying the word googly out loud. And okay, like I say, I try not to be judgmental about design principles, but I do admit, whenever I see a list of design principles and it's a nice, even, round 10, I think, really, that's convenient. It just happened to work out, like not 9, not 11, just a perfect 10. You just imagine they're sitting in a meeting going, oh, we need one more to make a 10. I don't know, I'm suspicious. Even really good design principles like Dieter Rams, fantastic designer, has a terrific collection of design principles. 10 Principles for Good Design. If you haven't seen Dieter Rams' principles, they're well worth looking at. But even here, I'm like, really, Dieter? 10. Exactly 10. And if you think I'm being blasphemous by possibly suggesting anything about the great Dieter Rams, I'm not being blasphemous. Being blasphemous would be pointing out that in the Old Testament, Moses gets 10 commandments. Not 11, not 9, 10 commandments. Nah, I don't buy it. But looking at all these different design principles, I start to wonder, like, okay, I'm spotting these patterns, like if it's an even number like 10, that's a bit suspicious. What else can I spot in the overall meta patterns that point to whether this is a good list of design principles or a not so good list of design principles? Effectively, what I'm asking here is, are there design principles for design principles? And I think there might be, or guidelines at least. So for example, if you see a design principle that says something like, make it usable, I would say that's a bad design principle. It's not a bad design principle because I disagree with it, quite the opposite. It's a bad design principle because I agree with it, and so does everybody else. How are you going to disagree with that? Make it usable. It's so agreeable that there's not much point framing it like this. Now, if you were to reframe it more like this, to say, usability is more important than profitability. Ooh, now that's a controversial one. Now we're talking. Now we can have that discussion because somebody can go, actually, I'm not sure I agree with that. And you can hammer that out in an early stage. Because what happens here is you've got prioritization. And that's what matters, is saying, not just we value these things, but to say, we value these things in this order. And that's where design principles become useful, not for everyone agreeing. They're not some like kumbaya sitting around the campfire. Yeah, we all agree on this. The point of design principles is to hammer out disagreements early on to figure out, oh, actually, are you aligned with the principles of this project? So here's a framing that I think works really well for design principles. It's to say blank even over blank. So one thing you value even over another thing you value. So it really highlights the prioritization. So you could say something like usability even over profitability. And I think that's a valuable design principle for some organizations. The other nice thing about this framing is it kind of helps you do another kind of smell test on a design principle, which is it reversible? In other words, if you went to a completely different organization with a different set of values, different purpose, could you imagine that design principle being reversed? So somewhere else, they might have a design principle saying profitability even over usability. And it would make sense in that context for that organization. So if you see a design principle that just seems, like everyone agrees with it, there's no disagreement, it's probably not that useful. What you want are design principles specific to the project you're working on. Prioritization That's the key with design principles. In fact, my favorite design principle, and yes, I'm that much of a nerd, I have a favorite design principle, is literally called the priority of constituencies. And it comes from the HTML design principles, from the WhatWG. And it states, in case of conflict, consider users over authors, over implementers, over theoretical purity. I mean, first of all, the fact that it starts with in case of conflict. Yes, that's what design principles are for the conflict, for figuring out what to do when you're faced with two possible solutions. They're not about, like I said, sitting around a campfire and having agreement. They are about conflict. Also, just to point out, that's another useful factor in design principles, that it takes personal opinion out of it. Right? Instead of two people having an argument like, I believe we should do this, and the other person says, I think we should do this, you can step back and go, the design principle states we should value X over Y. Right? So can kind of take the ego out of things. But anyway, in case of conflict, consider users over authors, or users even over authors, authors even over implementers, implementers even over theoretical purity. I love that. That's just a great design principle for that project. And you can imagine another project where those could be completely reversed, right? So design principles should be specific to the project, the individual project or the organization that you're working on. But could it be that there are such things as universal principles that could be applied across the board? I'm not sure if they count as principles, but there's this whole kind of group of aphorisms and sayings that we call laws. They're usually eponymous laws. They're named after somebody, and they work kind of like design principles. Like Hofstadter's law, this is from Douglas Hofstadter. Hofstadter's law states, it always takes longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law. So kind of a recursive law there. And this certainly has the feel of universality to me, as in my lived experience up to this point supports Hofstadter's law on every single project I've ever worked on. Sturgeon's laws. Theodore Sturgeon was a science fiction writer. People would give science fiction a bad name, saying it was all a load of crap. And he would say, yeah, 90% of science fiction is crap. But that's because 90% of everything is crap. Right? You know, look at movies, look at books, look at television and go, yeah, 90% of it's crap. That's Sturgeon's law. Again, it certainly has the feel of something universal and true. Murphy's Law is one you're probably all familiar with, right? And it kind of gets passed around as a joke that, oh, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. I actually think it's a super valuable design principle that we could use a lot more of on the web. And it comes from a real person, Aloysius Murphy. He was an aerospace engineer. And because this was his attitude, no one ever died on his watch. So I think Murphy's Law is super valuable. And there's Cole and the universal law there, which is shredded raw cabbage with vinaigrette or mayonnaise dressing. That's coleslaw. Sorry. And there's kind of a subsection of these eponymous laws that are called razors, that are specifically about when you're faced with a decision. You have to make a decision between one solution and another solution. There are these kind of eponymous razors, like Hanlon's razor. This is useful, when you're evaluating, what's going on in the news, the world. You're trying to lay blame. Hanlon's razor states, never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by incompetence. I think that's useful, especially if you're a conspiracy theorist, like bear Hanlon's razor, and it's probably just people being idiots. And looking at how governments work a lot of times, think, yeah, that's Hanlon's razor in action. Though I should point out, there's another set of eponymous laws from another science fiction author, Arthur C. Clarke, Clarke's 3 laws. And Arthur C. Clarke's 3rd law states that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Now, if you take Clarke's 3rd law and you mash it up with Hanlon's razor, then you come to the conclusion that any sufficiently advanced incompetence is indistinguishable from malice. Occam's razor, going back a long time, Occam's razor often gets misrepresented. Occam's razor is often dumbed down to the most obvious answer is the right answer. That's not necessarily true. What Occam's razor states is that entities should not be multiplied without necessity. So like if you're trying to explain something that happened and you say aliens did it, All you've done now is you have to give an explanation for the existence of aliens. So where did they come from? How are they doing this, right? And you're just multiplying the entities. So most conspiracy theories, for example, would fail Occam's razor at the first hurdle. So perhaps there are these universal design principles that you can use alongside the design principles specific to the project you're working on. And then I wonder, well, can you borrow principles from existing projects that feel like what you're working on? Is it possible to reuse them? So I was wondering whether it would be possible to look at the design principles behind the medium that I work in, which is the World Wide Web. I'm a big fan. And the World Wide Web is a creation. It was made by humans, so there's design principles, there's biases and assumptions built into it, whether we like it or not. In this case, it's built by this human, Tim Berners-Lee, when he was working at CERN in the late 80s and early 90s. And he had played around with some other hypertext systems before, but it was in 1989 that he submitted this paper, Information Management, a Proposal, a very dull paper with incomprehensible diagrams for this thing that just sounds very boring. But his supervisor, Mike Sendell, he must have seen the possibility here, because he scrolled across the top, vague but exciting. And so Tim Berners-Lee got to go ahead, all right, you go off and work on this proposal of yours, and this is how we got the World Wide Web. This was published March 12th, 1989. And you can see Tim Berners-Lee's original computer in the Science Museum down in London. This is the Next Cube that he built the first web browser and the first web server on, and came up with the HTML and HTTP and the idea of URLs. I have a real soft spot for this machine, because I was really fortunate back in 2019 to be invited along with a bunch of other folk much cleverer than me to participate in a project at CERN. This was coming up on the 30th anniversary of the publication of that paper in March of 1989. And you can see the results of that URL, worldwideweb30.com. And what we were working on there was trying to recreate the very first web browser that Tim Berners-Lee had written on that Next Cube. And this web browser was very confusingly called World Wide Web. And this, you can see it here. And what this is an emulation of that first web browser running inside a modern web browser. So you can go to this URL, fire up an emulation of the first web browser, and then put in your own company's URL and see how would it behave inside the world's very first web browser. I didn't do this part. This was the smart people building this. I spent most of my time working on the website describing the project. In particular, I spent most of my time building this timeline. So this was coming up on the 30th anniversary in the web, and the kind of the obvious thing to do was look at what's happened in 30 years of the web. But what I was also interested in is what happened in the 30 years before the web? What were the influences? What were the assumptions that Tim Berners-Lee had going into it? Were there design principles that informed some of his decision-making that resulted in the World Wide Web that we got? Because there's nothing inevitable about the World Wide Web we got. Right? Something like the World Wide Web probably was inevitable, but the specific World Wide Web we ended up with, that's a result of all these influences from networks and hypertext and formats. And you don't have to actually look that hard to find were there any design principles influencing Tim Berners-Lee, because he's published them. In 1998, he published this document, Axioms of Web Architecture. And I think they're really useful. And I think if you're building on the web, you can learn from these principles that he had in mind when he was building the web. And I think these are particularly useful for that second diamond where you're executing, right? This is building the thing right. And he talked about how he borrowed design principles from existing fields. The web is built on top of the internet. The internet has assumptions and biases and values and principles built in. So he used that. And software already existed, and there were things he liked about some software and things he didn't like about others, and he took the stuff that he liked. So he said, principles such as simplicity and modularity are the stuff of software engineering. Right, so simplicity, modularity, those are the key words. Good. Those kind of relate to some universal principles as well, kind of like Occam's law that we were talking about, Occam's razor. Entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily. It's somewhat related to the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid, right? As simple as possible, but no simpler. So simplicity and modularity, Thank you very much. I'll take that from the world of software engineering. And then he says, decentralization and tolerance are the life and breath of the internet. I said, the web is built on top of the internet. Those principles then informed the World Wide Web. Now, in particular, this one, tolerance, this idea that for a system to be resilient, for it to be tolerant, there are certain ways of building it. And that's something he definitely learned from the way the internet was designed. In particular, this man, John Postel, mostly responsible for the domain name system. He was kind of the caretaker of the domain name system for most of his life. And he has an eponymous law named after him. It's also called the Robustness principle, or Postel's law. I think it's super useful. Postel's law states, be conservative in what you send, be liberal in what you accept. Now, John Postel was talking about packet switching. He's talking about when a packet of data is being switched around the internet. If you're sending a packet of data, please try to make it as well-formed as possible, right? Be conservative in what you send. But if you're receiving a packet of data from somewhere else and it's not well-formed, there's something wrong with it, be tolerant. Don't be a dick about it. Like if you get what it's trying to say, then accept it. Be liberal in what you accept. Not an entirely new idea. I mean, going back to Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher and Roman emperor, he said, be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. And this is kind of that principle applied to the internet. Now, this sounds like a very technical principle, that it's about packet switching and data. But I find it coming up in the world of design all the time. Let's take a simple example on the web. You're building a form. Okay, first of all, what form fields are you going to put on the page? Well, the classic thing is as few as possible, right? Oh, don't ask for something if you don't actually need the data. So be conservative in what you send. As few form fields as possible. However, once somebody is inputting into that form field, or into that form, please be tolerant in what you accept. Do not make people format their credit card numbers or their phone numbers in a certain way, with dashes, without dashes. You can figure this stuff out. Be tolerant in what you accept. So Postel's law, I find, applies, it's maybe as close to a universal law on the World Wide Web as I've found. I mean, particularly the first bit, be conservative in what you send. If you take that quite literally, as in what you are sending from a server down the wire to a client, I think we could be a lot more conservative in what we're sending. We're just sending too much, too many bytes going down the wire. That's why the web gets a bad reputation. Sturgeon's law definitely applies to web performance. 90% of the web is crap when it comes to the sheer amount of stuff. I was doing some consulting for a client recently, and we were kind of trying to rank the worst problems of how much stuff we're sending down the wire. And I came up with kind of a top 4 offenders in the bytes being sent down the wire. And coming in at number 4, we've got web fonts, because they can add up, It's specific to the medium. Like if you're designing something in print and you want a different font for every word, it's like, yeah, sure, go ahead. It's not expensive. But if we're on the web, then every weight of every font can be a real challenge. But this is fixable. Like, we've got ways around it. We can subset our fonts. We've got variable fonts now, which are awesome. There are ways around this, is what I'm saying. 3, images. It's a big part of why the web feels slow, and certainly a big part of literally the amount of data going across the web. There are strong environmental reasons why you want to reduce the amount of images on the web. But again, we have a lot of solutions now that we didn't have even a few years ago. We can lazy load images. We can choose the right formats. There's a whole bunch of new image formats that are supported in web browsers these days that can really bring down the file size. So I feel like, we're making a lot of progress here. Responsive images, that's a solved problem now, which is amazing. All right, number 2, worst offender for what we're sending down the wire, is your JavaScript, as in the JavaScript that you write for your application. There's just too much of it. Like, JavaScript doesn't necessarily need to do everything, right? And if you're using a library, you've got to ship the library to the end user, as well as your own code. This can definitely be improved for a lot of websites. However, it's not as bad as the worst offender, which is other people's JavaScript, third-party JavaScript. It kind of doesn't matter how conscientious you are about web performance if you then have to add in some script element to some tracking service or ad company that pursues to pull in just megabytes of unnecessary JavaScript. And usually, it disrupts the whole loading experience. It's bad. Just say no to other people's JavaScript. I think it was a bad idea that we allowed JavaScript to be loaded from other domains, personally. I think JavaScript should be same origin. JavaScript in particular is troublesome, because with images and fonts and all that stuff, yeah, okay, it's literally the file size, the size of the font, the size of the images. But with JavaScript, there's the size, and then the fact that this is executable code. So it has not only has all to download before it can be executed, then the browser has to parse it. The browser is effectively acting as a computer, and then execute it. And if you've got a big chunk of JavaScript, that's a lot that's going to slow down the user, particularly on lower-end devices, which is most of the world. So JavaScript I find really problematic in terms of not being conservative in what we send. In fact, there's another eponymous law from Jeff Atwood, the guy behind Stack Overflow, who noticed that any application that can be written in JavaScript will eventually be written in JavaScript. And it's true, I remember years ago and be like, you're doing something on the web. It's like, yeah, but you could never do Photoshop on the web. Now Photoshop is literally on the web. I think there's a universal law that we could apply along with Postel's law when it comes to building on the web and choosing our technologies. And that's a principle called the principle of least power. And this is something that Tim Berners-Lee absolutely had in mind when he was building the World Wide Web. This was one of his watchwords. The principle of least power states, choose the least powerful language suitable for a given purpose, which sounds counterintuitive at first, but it's kind of like Occam's razor again. Don't multiply entities. So the problem is that when you've got a powerful language, that power usually comes at a cost. That maybe it's more fragile, or it's not as universally supported. When you've got a universal, ubiquitous language, it might not be as powerful, but it's probably going to be more robust. To give you an example, here's a quote from my friend Derek Featherstone. He's an accessibility advocate. And he said a while back, he said, in the web front-end stack, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and ARIA, if you can solve a problem with a simpler solution lower in the stack, you should, right? It's less fragile, more foolproof, and just works. So here he's talking about resilience, right? Less fragile, more foolproof, about making something that can stand up to unexpected things happening. So the classic example is ARIA. Like the best ARIA role is not using an ARIA role, but using an HTML element that works instead. So instead of having div role equals button, just use a button, right? If you can do something in CSS or JavaScript, choose CSS, because it's going to be the simpler solution. So always try and look for the solution lower in the stack, and then only reach for the more powerful language when you have to. There's a set of design principles from GDS, the Government Digital Services. They're really good. They are good design principles. And one of their design principles states simply, do less. And to explain it, what they say is, government should only do what only government can do. And I think this is really good. So government shouldn't try to be doing all things. If private enterprise can do something better, let private enterprise take care of it. But government should only do what only government can do. And I think you can apply this to technology. If we abstract it out, we end up with something like this. Any particular technology should only do what that particular technology can do. That's a bit too abstract. So let's hone in and let's put a specific technology in here. Let's put JavaScript in here. JavaScript should only do what only JavaScript can do. We can call it Keith's law, or Keith's razor, perhaps. But I think it's true. It's like, technically, you can do everything in JavaScript. If you want to create HTML, you can create a DOM using JavaScript. But should you? Right? If you want to add styles, you can write CSS in JS. But should you? Maybe JavaScript should only do what only JavaScript can do. I'll wrap up by illustrating this with some situations where you're going to have to choose between one solution or another, and you might need to apply some principles. So 3 different components you might come across. Start with one I already mentioned, a button component. On the one hand, what you could do is you could create this button using divs and spans, style it how you want. You're going to have to write all the JavaScript to handle the clicks and all the possible edge cases, and you're going to have to make sure it's accessible and add all the ARIA roles. Or you can use a button element, and you style it however you want. Now, in this case, I don't really need design principles to guide me here. There's a really obvious right answer and a really obvious wrong answer. You use the button. There's literally no reason not to. Many years ago, it used to be harder to style buttons in like Internet Explorer version, single digit. But these days, there's absolutely no reason for doing this, okay? So I probably don't even need a design principle to help me here. But let's take another component, a drop-down. The user needs to choose one option from a list of options. Again, I can write it this myself using divs and spans, CSS, JavaScript, bunch of ARIA, try to make it accessible. Or I use the native HTML select element and style it with CSS, which will work up to a point. At least I can style the closed state of a select element. If you really want to be able to style the open state, no, sorry, you can't do that. So then your only option is to kind of make your own one from scratch. Now, personally, I would still go with the native HTML element and say, live with it, right? But I can understand. I can at least see the argument for doing it yourself if what you prioritize is that level of control, that you really want it to look a certain way. So again, depends on your priorities. All right, third and final component, let's say you've got a date picker. The user is selecting a particular date from a calendar. You can create this yourself, div, span, CSS, JavaScript, load of ARIA, or you can use the native HTML input type equals date. Fantastic, job done, style it. Yeah, no. Has anyone ever tried to style an HTML input type equals date? There's very little control you have. Now again, I'd probably fall in the camp going, screw it, I'm still going to I'm really lazy, so if there's an easier option, I will take the easier option. But I totally get why people are creating their own date pickers, and writing all that JavaScript and having to figure out the accessibility issues. I get it. So fundamentally, this is like a spectrum. You're going from least power in some ways to most power. And if I apply the principle of least power, I'm going to go with the native elements each time, but I am going to pay the price. I don't get the control I want. But what I do get is that I get to use a really simple under-engineered solution and not building something potentially more fragile. Like the browser maker has done all the work for me. There's kind of this pendulum swing, it seems to me, on the web between, hey, just go with the under-engineered solution, bam, you're done. It's more resilient because the browser does it for you. Or build everything yourself. You get a lot more control, but it feels more over-engineered. So if I value access, universality, the most number of people being able to accomplish their task, I'm going to go with the least power. I'm going to go with the native HTML elements. But if I value control, then yeah, I'm going to build all of these myself because I want that fine-grained control. So what we have here is, priorities. If I value access over control, then I'll go with that. If you value control over access, you go with building it yourself. So it depends is the answer. But again, we're building on the World Wide Web, and I do feel we can learn from the principles that informed the World Wide Web. Eric Meyer put it really well. He said, the web does not value consistency. The web values ubiquity. And I think that's true, that the purpose of the web is not necessarily to be the best, but to be the most universal, to be the most available to the most number of people. Or to rephrase what Eric is saying here, ubiquity, even over consistency. This is a good design principle. And it passes the reversibility test. You can absolutely imagine systems where it's consistency, even over ubiquity. Native apps. If you build an iOS app, it's going to be very consistent on iOS, but you can't install it on Android, right? So you sacrifice that universality. Or, looking back to our own past, Flash. It was very, very consistent, but the price you paid was lock-in. This was proprietary. You had to have the Flash plugin. So it was a choice between everything looking really consistent or nothing. Whereas the web doesn't work like that. The World Wide Web values ubiquity even over consistency. And I think we should too. I showed you that first ever website inside the first ever web browser. It's kind of amazing. This first ever web page is still online at CERN, and this is how it looked when Tim Berners-Lee wrote that first web browser. Great, but what I kind of find amazing, what blows my mind, is that you could visit that first web page at its original URL in a modern web browser, a browser that just got updated this morning, and it still works. That the web is still working after 30 years. I mean, if you took a word processing document from 30 years ago and you tried to open it on a computer today, good luck, right? And yet, the World Wide Web does work like that. You know, layers of improvements, but never sacrificing backward compatibility. So I think we can learn from the World Wide Web. Apply the principle of least power. Apply the robustness principle. Be conservative in what you send. Be liberal in what you accept. Value ubiquity, even over consistency. Value universal access over control. And that way you make products and services that aren't just on the web, but are truly of the web. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Help yourself to water. That was fascinating. Just a few questions, and then we'll see if there's any from the floor. Were you here yesterday? You heard Mark. So you heard Mark talking the first speech about the challenges of finding that common language between designers and engineers. Yeah. What's your thoughts on that? And maybe your kind of view on how to meet that challenge?
Yeah, I think Mark was spot on when he talked about basically you have to have your principles that he called them the foundations.
Yeah.
That then literally get reflected in the patterns. I just took it a bit further, going that there's actually a phase below that, which is your purpose, which I know is going very philosophical and wide and big picture. There is a challenge. Like, you could be in a situation where somebody in the organization just fundamentally isn't on board with one of the principles. And in that situation, either that person has got to go, okay, I'll bite my tongue and I'll go along with it, or walk out the door.
So it's a cultural, it's an organizational.
Yeah, and in a roundabout way, from the purpose to the principles to the patterns, it sounds extreme, but in a way that the purpose, the values of the company get encoded into the pixels on the screen. The way something works. I mean, company culture often gets quite literally encoded. When you go to some websites and you can literally see the org chart of the website in how the website is presented to end users. You don't want that. You don't want to literally expose your organizational structure. But you kind of do want to infuse the purpose into what users eventually end up, for good or bad. Like, everyone was going to point to the good examples, oh, this is so well designed and the company values this and that's why it works. But you take a company like Ryanair, who are famously, not customer-centric, shall we put it.
That was tactful.
Yeah. And there's all kinds of examples of deceptive dark patterns on Ryanair's website. Like, you're trying to not buy travel insurance, and it's between Latvia and Lithuania, and drop down it. I'm not even kidding. It's like that. There's a point to be made for saying, well, that's actually good design. From the point, not good design in the universal sense, but from the viewpoint of Ryanair and what Ryanair values, which is money.
It's a good job.
It's that designer is being true to the principles and the purpose of that company. And that's what I mean. It's like, sometimes the best thing to do is maybe not bite your tongue and go along with it, but actually say, we don't align at a fundamental level of the principles, so I can't just make the patterns and shut up. I feel like I have to say something. So for good or ill, I mean, the ideal situation is you're working somewhere where you're totally aligned at the values level, the principles, and then it's a joy to make the patterns.
You mentioned in the blurb I read about you, you talk about accessible, building websites accessible and beautiful. I'm interested in the aesthetics. We heard Andy was really interesting yesterday in some iconic images. How important are the aesthetics to you? Where does that come in priorities, do you think?
Well, I said beautiful. I didn't say aesthetics.
I like the word aesthetics. Yeah.
But to get into semantics. beauty is more than skin deep or more than pixel deep. So the examples there where I was saying, like, personally, I would go with the native HTML element, even if that gives me less control over the aesthetic presentation. Because I think the fact that that would then be more accessible to more people is beautiful. So we can conflate the idea of beauty with just the
purely
aesthetics. And I actually think that
So how important are the aesthetics? Let's look at that.
They
just
are
at that
important.
surface.
And I've kind of come around to realizing that, you know, in the past I would get angry at people who were making everything from scratch with divs and loads of JavaScript and ARIA. But I realized, well, if what they value is, you know, the pixel perfection, then telling them, no, you shouldn't do that. You should use the native HTML elements. It's kind of like if there's an issue with teen pregnancy, my solution is don't have sex. It's like, it's not realistic.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly. What I actually need to accept is it's going to happen anyway. So how do we make it happen in a way that's more robust? So that's why there's a project right now called openui.org. And what they're looking at is where is the web platform still failing designers? Where aren't we able to get the control we need, the aesthetic control? So select drop-downs are a classic example. They're working on how can we make select more stylable? And that's the right approach, not my approach, which was like, don't do that. You know, that's just being an old man yelling at cloud.
Given that tomorrow will be 2 years since the UK shutdown, went into lockdown, the first lockdown, 2 years, which is quite incredible. How has your working practices, your mixture of home and office, how has that changed in the last 2 years? Yeah,
it changed completely. So at Clearleft, we're not huge, we're like 20 people. It was a week before the official lockdown. We gathered together in a room at the studio, and my co-founder, Rich, he's got a science background, and he was looking at the charts, and he goes, this is an exponential chart. It only goes one way from here. The government are still dilly-dallying. Cheltenham races are still happening. Oh, God, yeah. We're like, no, we can't rely on the government here. We're going to make our own decisions.
That was 2 years on
yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable. So we said, as of today, Clearleft is a remote company. We sort of pooled our resources to cars and vans to get the Aeron chairs and cinema displays back to our houses, and that's what we've been doing. And it's been tough. I think tougher for some people rather than others.
So is your office still home working? Are you still home working? Okay.
Yes, we've opened up the studio again if people want to go in. This is the irony now, is that actually if you want to get work done, you stay home, but if you want to socialize, you go into the office, right? Like the office has become the place where, I want to hang out with people and not get any work done. I'm going into the office. But particularly the kind of work I ended up doing, where it's kind of heads down, I want to be alone, the homeworking was kind of great.
Yeah.
Homeworking is great for the kind of work where if you were in an open plan office, you'd put on headphones for it, right? That's what it's not so great for. We heard this from lots of people, is the serendipitous stuff. Like someone's got the post-it notes on the whiteboard, and you walk by and go, that's interesting. And we've lost that. I tend to do less collaborative work. I'm a bit of a loner, so it doesn't bother me too much, but I can totally see how that's tricky. And I think at the start of lockdown as well, do you remember in the design world when for a while we were all talking about skeuomorphic design and just imitating the look of real things but in pixels? I think we did that with work for a while. It's like, we don't have real post-it notes or real whiteboards, so we're going to invent pixel versions of them, right? And like spending a lot of time in Miro and stuff like that.
It was interesting speaking to some of the speakers yesterday about that uncertainty that was absolutely apparent at the start of the pandemic and lockdown. How did that impact on how you could plan for the future?
Yeah, that was a big deal for us because we're in client services. And so the uncertainty was like, are we even going to make it through this?
Yeah.
That was.
And was there moments you did think that seriously? You thought, how are we going to?
At the very start, yeah, because contingency planning, you've got to have a best case and worst case scenario.
Yeah.
In the worst case scenario, we just didn't make it. We've always been pretty conservative with our budget, so we had a runway. We don't live on the edge. But still, we took steps. Let's assume the worst case scenario for now. So, for example, I came down to a 2-day work week for a little while. When the furlough scheme was introduced, we took advantage of that. Again, kind of like, okay, let's kind of protect it. As it turned out, we made it through. Things weren't as bad as we as the worst case scenario. We shrunk a bit and then we built back up again. I took on more days, although I have to say, when it came to ramping back up, I stopped at 4 days, and I'm sticking.
I think I'm hearing that from a lot of people, if their organisation will go with that.
So it's the interesting, the 4-day work week thing absolutely works great if it's a whole organisation. It's kind of like what I was talking about there. It's got to come from the values, the reason you're doing this. And then it works great if you say every single person in the company is going to a 4-day work week with no loss of pay. And this is the way things are going in Finland. This is the way things are going in other countries.
Yeah.
We couldn't do that at Clear Left just yet. Time will tell. So I had to take a pay cut to go down to 4 days. But there's other things we could introduce that worked really well. So for now, Fridays, because I'm not the first person to go to 4 days. Other people at Clear Left work 4-day weeks and have done since before the pandemic. Fridays are now a meeting-free day. You cannot book a meeting on a Friday with anybody, including clients. So what that means is if someone like me working a 4-day week, I know I'm not missing out. I don't have that FOMO of like, I'm not working and I should be working.
Yeah.
But likewise, the people working 5-day weeks have got that to look forward to for that heads down, headphones on work. They're like, on Friday, I'm gonna get the
great idea.
So it is good. It's working out really well. But I think the actual best solution is 4-day work week for the entire company, no loss of pay. It's just normal now. It's interesting. Just last week I was talking to someone in the States at a company where they've done that. That surprises me that they would be able to do it in the States. Yeah. Here over in Europe, I think it's less surprising. Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, you can see.
I think they've got it nailed. You've had it nailed. You've got a lot of stuff nailed.
Exactly. But I was impressed to see even an American country. And again, what it came down to was the purpose of the company, what they truly believed. It's really interesting too, I find, when you see what companies claim is their purpose. Like, we're changing the world. Oh, how about a 4-day work week? Oh no, that's meddling with forces beyond our control.
You can have a ping pong table though.
Yeah.
Any questions at all for Jeremy? Yes, the gentleman there. We'll get a mic over to you. So we've got a couple of minutes left if you want.
Hey, how's it going? I just wanted to touch on the third-party scripts, and I was just wondering what has Clear Left done. I've seen a big push towards cookieless websites, trying to avoid third parties, using Fathom Analytics instead of Google Analytics. Has Clear Left kind of gone in any direction with that?
Well, Clear Left, it depends on which project. Any project I've done, yes. So, for example, I started a podcast during the pandemic, because of course I did. And that's HTML, CSS, maybe a little bit of JavaScript, but absolutely no third-party scripts, because I've got control over that. So in client work, it's almost impossible to get them to not have third-party scripts. I've had constructive conversations with marketing people, for example. But a lot of it is about making them aware. They don't realize that when they install that one tiny little Google Tag Manager script, they don't realize that script can pull in another script, which can pull in another script. There's that great tool, what's it called? It maps out in circles where, request map. Oh, look at request map. It's and put in a big publishing company in there, and you see that one tiny script pulled in a bigger script, pulled in a bigger script. There's always a bigger fish, right? In terms of analytics, you mentioned Fathom, and there's some others out there that are they work like Google. Everyone's addicted to Google Analytics, and actually you're only using 5% of the stuff it could provide anyway. And the problem there is that then Google can track you across sites. So that's the idea of, understanding how people are moving around on your own website, fine. Server logs have existed from the start. People moving from site to site or from Google to a particular site, no. And that is why the GDPR is rightly against that. So yes, some self-hosted analytics like Fathom is going to be superior to Google Analytics from a privacy point of view while providing you with all the functionality. But like I say, a lot of it comes down to conversations. And often it's marketing, people like that. They want to see the numbers. They're obsessed with numbers. And just explaining to them, actually, I can get you the numbers you want without our first step being install Google Tag Manager or install some third-party script. You tell me what you need, and I'll find a way to get that to you in a way that preserves the privacy of our users. And actually, I'm just talking about privacy there, not even the performance implications. I think healthy paranoia is good to have when it comes to any third-party thing on your site, especially JavaScript, because that's third-party content that can execute arbitrary code. That's madness.
I think we're going to stick to time, actually. Thank you
All right.
so much. You're around for the rest of the day,
I
though,
am,
aren't you?
yes,
So
come
Jeremy
up.
is extremely approachable and will answer any questions. Thank you so much, Jeremy Keith.